What's up, guys? This is actually episode 15. Last one was episode 14. And today we're going to take a look at the start time attribute. So we've actually written this gem with a hard-coded attribute in here, start time. And that's one of those easy mistakes to make when you're extracting this from a Rails app. You're going to have this thing that needs to be dynamic, and you've got to make sure that you replace it in a logical manner. Otherwise, you're going to ship this code to GitHub and Rubygems, and then people are going to try it out and use a different column name, and they're going to be screwed. And that would be that would be really bad, because we would publish this thing and be so proud of it, and then we'd be like, oh man, why did we miss this such obvious mistake? So today we're going to take a look at that and make sure that we get this start time removed and just replaced as the default so that you can put in your own attribute name. So ideally, what I would like to do is just add an option in here and say attribute is starts at. Starts at would be great, and as a useful replacement to this idea of model additions that we had before. So let's take a look at GitHub, because I've already deleted this file out of the gem to prepare for this episode, and that all I did was I deleted this line of code here, model additions. I deleted this extended helper here, which basically says, hey, if there is anything that extends Simple Calendar's model additions class, then make sure that you include this has calendar method. So let's take a look at that. This model additions is basically a little concern, like you would expect from a Rails concern. And it basically just says, hey, let's set the default attribute name to starts at. And this is what I used in the past. And if you passed in an option, then it would just allow you to replace that. And we had a simple calendar start time attribute that we would always call, and that would delegate to the one that you defined. And that's not a bad solution, but it's like, a good 25, 30 lines of code. Like, this is 16. We also had this 8 lines of code here, and we've got a require there, and we don't really need any of this stuff with our new design because we could just pass in that attribute here. It makes a little more sense, but because this is literally the only feature we have as part of this model additions, I don't see why we need it to be included inside the model. So I think we're going to scrap it, and that's what we're going to do today. I just deleted this. So I deleted this, deleted the require line, and I deleted this model additions file locally, and we're going to replace it with this little option in the calendar instantiate new method. That's it. So how do we make this work? Well, we're passing in that attribute as an option, so it'd be nice if we could access that. So let's just make a little helper here, and we'll call it attribute, and we'll say options fetch attribute, and the default is going to be start time. So we'll have a default, and then we'll be able to remove these two references to that by replacing it with a dynamic call to attribute. So send is the Ruby method to call a method on an instance with a certain name. So you pass in a symbol. Another thing we can probably do here is toSym to ensure that we get a symbol. And then you basically just tell it, hey, call this method on that event, whatever it is. And we should be able to also just replace this with attribute. And that should do it. This should allow us to call that every single time. And that should be it. So let's open up our terminal, restart our Rails app. And for this calendar, I just added a migration before the episode as well to add a starts at timestamp. And let's refresh this page and see what happens. That did not do anything. So let's see, we didn't save this file. So starts at is another column. This actually displayed the start time, so it called that method. If we save this file, this should call starts at, and we should be able to see something different. And we get a failure now because it called toDate on nil class. Now you might be worried about this, that we made a mistake. And we did sort of, but if you click on full trace and you look at the line of code that it crashed on lib simple calendar line 38. So what is that line? This file, line 38. And it crashed trying to call toDate on nil class, which means send attribute returned nil. If you've ever used the terminal prompt, the console in the error page, you'll love it because you can use it to grab all the variables from where it crashed at. So if you clicked on this, you would get that context, which means you can basically interact with all the variables right here, right when it died. So that's cool. We can see the attribute, and that was starts at, and we can even test out event.send attribute, and we get nil back, as it said it did. But what we've noticed here is that this is kind of implying that that was a required attribute. And we've done no such thing to require that. It just happens to be that our previous start times, we'd never tested without a start time. There was always one, and it was never nil. So we've discovered a bug in our previous code that we didn't even know we had, which is kind of important, and another reason why you actually want to write tests for this stuff, which we will cover. But you want to make sure that you can handle these when there's a nil. So what do you actually do when the time for an event is nil, when there's no start time? I think the sane thing to do that you would expect is that just doesn't show up in the calendar. Now, that might be confusing to some people. They might be curious as to why it just doesn't show up. So maybe there's something we need to do, like write a message into the log file. I personally think you can figure it out as long as you're writing your own Rails code, so we're not going to write that to the log file, but we do need to write some code in here that sets the start time and make sure that it is present before we try and add it to the calendar. So this is going to allow us to verify that there is a start time before we even try and add it to the calendar and call toDate on it and all that. So now if we restart our Rails server and refresh this page, that should fix our problem, but we shouldn't actually see any events on the calendar, and we don't. Now if we edit this, I actually need to set a start time. So let's just run Rails console. Let's grab the first meeting and update the starts at attribute to time.zone.now. And we got an error. Start at, I had the incorrect attribute name. It starts at, and voila, we're done. So we've set the start time for one of these meetings. We should be able to refresh this and it should show up on the correct day. And it does. So we get the holiday on July 20th. And we now have dynamic attributes. So we can delete this and it should use the start time. And both of them should show up. And it does. So that's super duper cool. We've got dynamic attributes on our method, dynamic method calls on our meetings or our events for our calendars. So that's nifty, and it allows us to make that all much more dynamic than we had before, which is super important. And we even solved a bug that we didn't know of before, and that's one of those things we definitely want to make sure that we write a test for. So let's go into our calendar spec, and let's add one for it doesn't crash when an event has a nil start time. So that's going to be super important. We'll make sure that we write a test for it, because when you discover a bug like that, if it's subtle enough like that one was, we didn't even discover it until 15 days later. We definitely want to write a test for that so it never comes up again, because it's such an obvious thing that we should cover, but we just simply overlooked it because it's easy to overlook something like that. So this is going to be good, and I think we're pretty much getting close to just finishing up by writing our tests and verifying that we have sort of all the basics done, and we can push out Simple Calendar 2.0 pretty soon. So a few more changes we need to make, but we need to revisit our specs that we wrote originally, because a lot has changed, and we want to make sure that these tests are still relevant. Like, I don't think that we need to really deal with verifying that it has a title or a next or previous link as much anymore, because the views are different. I think it will be good when people are contributing to Simple Calendar in the future, just to make sure they don't like delete that line and think that's a good idea. But at the same time, like, it really doesn't matter. Like, so long as that view gets rendered, it's okay. Like, we might decide that, these are unimportant and delete those tests, because the core of it is make sure you render that partial. And that's the important piece. What's in the partial is a little less relevant, but it could be good to have those. We might be going a little overboard, and that's kind of where learning about how much do you test and what do you test is important, because you need to have easily editable tests. At the same time, they need to cover as much as you can without being overbearing and just being like, just so painful to work with. If you've ever used an application that just has enormous amounts of tests that are so tightly tied to the specifics of the code, testing is like the worst thing in the world. At the same time, if you have good tests and they're flexible, testing can like really be beautiful and amazing, and just keep you going and making just amazing stuff. So it can be either the worst thing or the best thing. You got to do your testing right, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of vlogs, I imagine. We'll probably do a few vlogs on that, because we got a lot of tests to write. So yeah, that is it for this episode, and I'll see you next time. Peace.